Hello and welcome, everyone. Today we are having the Domestic Violence and Homeless 101 Victim Service Provider Training. This is being presented by the Safe Housing Alliance, and we are presenting this to the three-county continuum of care out in Western Massachusetts. This webinar will be in two parts, and this is part 1 of 2. My name is Charlena Powell. I identify as she, her pronouns. At the Safe Housing Alliance, I am the Director of Safe Housing, Survivor, and Equity Initiatives. Today, I'm wearing my hair pinned up with a white and pink scarf. I do not have glasses on, but I usually do have reading glasses. Just a few identifying things about myself. I identify as a Black African American. I also identify as a person with lived experience, and I identify as a technical assistance provider in the DV housing field. Okay, so today here are our learning objectives. We want to understand how racial and other disparities compound the barriers survivors face to accessing and maintaining safe housing. We also want to summarize the current and emerging strategies that address survivors' safe housing needs. We also want to understand the role of the homeless service system and opportunities for partnerships between victim service providers and homeless service providers. And we also want to share capacity building tools. We want to talk about different trainings that are available, resources for homeless and housing and victim advocates available through the Safe Housing Alliance, or SHA, and the Domestic Violence Technical Assistance Consortium, or DVH-TAC. Now, who are we? Safe Housing Alliance's mission is to ensure that survivors of domestic and sexual violence have a full range of safe housing options through improved access, increased resources, and innovative solutions, ultimately catalyzing a safe housing movement. Our vision is to create a world where safe housing and racial justice are human rights shared by everyone. And at the bottom of our screen, you'll see our website, which is safehousingta.org. Now, a little bit about our agenda for part 1. Today, we'll be discussing the intersection of racial and other disparities, domestic and sexual violence and homelessness, barriers to housing for survivors, evolving advocacy responses, and then we'll touch on innovative models for safe housing within the homeless response system and in healthcare. And at the very end of our two-part training, we'll talk about resources that are available in the field, and I'll also discuss them throughout. Now, here's some helpful definitions. I always like to set the tone with uncovering any acronyms or any terms that are pretty broad and breaking them down to exactly what does all this mean. So our first definition is for domestic violence, or DV. And DV is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. Domestic violence can include physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological actions or threats of actions. Now, sexual violence, or SV, and is any type of sexual contact or behavior that occurs without explicit consent. The definition of sexual assault includes forced sexual intercourse, forcible sodomy, child molestation, incest, fondling, and attempted rape. Many times, these definitions fall under the same umbrella, so we wanted to demystify what do these all mean. Next, we'll talk about human trafficking. Human trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a common sex act, which is induced by forced, fraud, or coercion, or in the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. That would be sex trafficking. Of a person of labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjugation to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. That would be labor trafficking. So again, human trafficking umbrella consists of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. It's two different entities. Stalking. Stalking is a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety or the safety of others, or suffers substantial emotional distress. Stalking sometimes can be a broad umbrella of gaslighting as well, and harassment. Now, helpful definitions continued. We're going to talk a little bit about housing. How does this all relate to housing? Homelessness. Homelessness is the extreme end of a continuum of housing instability, including living somewhere not meant for human habitation. Those at imminent risk of homelessness, including those fleeing domestic violence, those who are living in emergency shelters and transitional housing, and to an extent, those who are living in doubled up situations. And doubled up can also mean living in a friend, staying on somebody's couch, or couch surfing. Now, with the continuum of care, that is a governing body. It's a regional or local planning body that coordinates housing and services funding for homeless families and individuals. So they are the governing body that oversees in a county, or if you don't have a continuum of care, you might have a balance of state. But they coordinate housing and services funding programs. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how are we kind of defining what housing is right, and that's really safe housing. And safe is a very safe is open to interpretation for people. It's really based on your own personal experiences, what you would consider safe. But in order for, like, how we try to define it is safe housing is a full range of housing options and supports that survivors have access to, so they are able to decide the best ways to achieve safety and stability. And the key word in there is decision. You want to have a menu of options. And how we can really track all of these options, or track how we're really helping survivors, and quality assess ourselves, we use the Homeless Management Information System, and that is something that is required from HUD. And really, the HMIS is a locally administered data system used to record and analyze client, service, and housing data for individuals and families who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and other policymakers use HMIS data to better inform homeless policy and decision-making at the federal, state, and local levels. All right, and specific to victim service providers, when you're talking about domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, when you're talking about those type of populations, you want to try to use a comparable database system. That's what you like to develop. And what that is a comparable database must comply with HMIS requirements. So just what we talked about with HUD. Within the HMIS proposed rule, a comparable database is an alternative system that victim service providers use to collect client-level data over time and to generate aggregate reports based on that data. Now, the key thing with comparable database systems is having confidentiality for survivors. And that we'll talk a little bit more in part 2 of our training, of our DV101 training, and ensuring that survivors have certain protections in place in the comparable database. All right, so that's all for our definitions, but if there's any other definitions, please feel free to go ahead in the chat or in below comments about any other definitions that you'd like us to cover. We're going to move on into the intersection of racial and other disparities, domestic and sexual violence, and homelessness. How do all these things play a role with each other? How do they intersect? And with that, we're going to go to a brief video on these intersections of domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness. And this was made with the Safe Housing Partnerships.
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and more, experience compounded barriers that further homelessness and housing instability. A recent study found that 66% of people experiencing homelessness were Black, while 28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the U.S. general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member places an extra strain on family resources. Oftentimes, we tell a survivor experiencing homelessness to go to a relative or friend's house. However, network impoverishment can cause immense burdens on the existing limited finances and available support from that network. Racial disparities arise at every juncture, from the legal system to housing to healthcare to child welfare to public benefits. Understanding the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity, survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial inequity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it so we can do more about it together. To learn more, visit safehousingpartnerships.org.
Okay, so thank you for viewing our slide on, our video from the Safe Housing Partnerships on the intersections between racial equity, domestic violence, and homelessness. Now we're going to talk a little bit more deeper. We're going to dive into really what these things are. And those intersections are shown here in three intersecting ways. First, we want to discuss that domestic violence and sexual violence disproportionately impact those who are most marginalized in society. And then on the other side of the spectrum, in nearly every community, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are substantially overrepresented in the homeless population. Now, with BIPOC communities, we also want to address the differences between anti-oppression rights. So that includes a more of a lens of different types of survivors, those who are really experiencing anti-oppression. And in the real, intersection part of it, we want to recognize historical oppression and privileges, and privilege that acknowledges harms that extend on a geographical, institutional, and cultural level. So this is really talking about root causes of homelessness and root causes of racial equity. And racial inequality as it pertains to homelessness and affordable housing can really be a daunting topic to discuss. So I invite you to really engage with me in this conversation and take this back to your community, to your sites, and talk about this amongst your colleagues and friends and staff, because it's an ongoing thing that has to be developed. It's not just one-time training. And we want to also kind of work into historical and systemic discrimination and housing land policies, but we'll dig into that a little bit later. Now, we want to address the gender and racial wealth gap. Now, personal income impacts the ability to access resources needed for safety, but so do support from family, friends, and social and community networks, and language inclusion. Women who use domestic violence shelters tend to be more economically impoverished than the general population. And reports suggest that African American and Latinx women who use domestic violence shelters are able to maintain positive concepts despite the racism, sexism, and classism that can perpetuate an environment of relatively impoverished in economic resources, continued abuse, and inadequate formal community response. So despite all of those oppressive terms, many Black, African American, BIPOC individuals can really surpass and really have those positive self concepts, and that's really great. And I also wanted to highlight that they're most likely, when for survivors where they're seeking housing, they usually live in higher concentrations of poverty, even when they are not poor. So that might mean they'd like to be amongst their families and support networks, like we said in the beginning, just to have a sense of community. Even if they're not poor, they would like to live there. Okay, let's break down a little bit what racial equity means. So racial equity and racial inequality are two different things. Racial equity is the condition that would exist if a person's racial identity did not predict their outcome. It includes work to address root causes, historical repressions of inequities, and not just their manifestation. So of those root causes, we want to really focus on over time the generational wealth or unwealth of that community, and how it over time affects the new generation. Now, racial inequality refers to the unequal distribution of resources, power, and economic opportunity across race in a society. This can manifest itself in a magnitude of ways, including disparities in wealth, education, employment, housing, mobility, health, rates of incarceration, and more. And addressing and dismantling racial inequities in housing emphasizes the connections with other economic inequalities. Okay. Now, HUD recognizes all of these things, and there are here's some real good bullet points on national strategies to fight racial inequity. Now, in HUD's fiscal year 23 continuum of care priorities, one thing that they have been really committed to is providing $2.8 billion in competitive funding to homeless services organizations across the country for supportive services and housing programs for people experiencing homelessness. And they also want to further expand to the continuum of care program for Indian tribes and tribally designated housing entities, which in 2022 was the first year this was adopted. And in addition to that, there's a set aside for explicit funding for survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault and stalking, and youth. Number 2 is youth. There's set aside funding for that. And that's called that's called NOFO bonus funds. And really that's as far as fiscal year 23, that's to provide $52 million for new rapid rehousing, supportive services, and other activities known as the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or the NOFO bonus funds. And now the $52 million is spread across the nation, and each continuum of care has a certain allotted amount of NOFO bonus funds. And this is really exciting news that we have set aside specifically for domestic violence. And hopefully your organization is involved in this opportunity. And most recently, there has been a few things that have come out, and we also want to say we wanted to strengthen systems and programs to address racial equity within COCs. That is a part of HUD's priorities. In the NOFO application, there are a list of about 7 NOFO priorities, and racial equity is one of them. And as of May 2023, the United States National Plan to End Gender-Based Violence has been released. I want to quickly go over to our link that we have here. And that is, if you can see, there's the release of the National Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. And the first link is the link to the US National Plan. Briefly, I wanted to read the quotes from our current United States President and the Vice President. Unquote. As long as there are women in this country and around the world who live in fear of violence, there is more we have to do to fulfill this sacred commitment. No one, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, should experience abuse, period. And if they do, they should have the services and support they need to get through it. And we're not going to rest. President Joseph R. Biden. And from our VP, all Americans deserve to live free from violence. The president and I are fighting to ensure every woman in our nation is safe and people can thrive. President Biden and I will continue to stand up for women and girls as we build a nation that is more fair and just. And that is from our VP, Kamala Harris. Please feel free to take a look at the full report, which is that just came out recently this spring. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit more about that disproportionate impact that we had really talked about when we first talked about the intersections of domestic violence and homelessness. And here's some statistics we have here. Most minority groups make up a larger share of the homeless population than they do the general population. And to really display that, we have a chart that's comparing race at the top with homeless population. And we have a really big impact of Black identifying individuals, a smaller one of 2 or more races. And then we have the American Indian, Alaska Native populations. We have Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. We have Asian, and then to the far right, we have white. And compared to the US population, there's a disproportionate effect between how many white individuals are experiencing are in the population itself compared to the Black individuals. So you can see that there's a gap. There's a large gap between the two. That's the disproportionality. We also have for ethnicity with Hispanic, there is more, there is a homeless population that is more than the actual US population as a whole. So how can we kind of extrapolate some data points from that? Why are these things happening? And these are reports from 2019. To unpack that a little bit more, we have survivors prevalence now, and this is from the HUD 2020 annual Endless Homelessness Assessment Report, or the AHAR, to Congress. And this is in part 2 of their report. And these are some at-a-glance statistics from that's really relevant to domestic violence survivors. Just to give some stats points, I'm gonna go over this really briefly. We have the total number of DV survivors who were counted among homeless people, including adults and children, served in emergency shelter, or ES, supportive housing, or SH, and transitional housing, or TH programs. And the total number of survivors that were counted was 203, a little bit over 203,000, or 20%, about 20% of homeless people. So we got about 20% of homeless people counting as DV survivors. And then we have the total number of DV survivors in adults-only households served in ES, SH, and TH programs. And that would be about 150 or 151,493, or 18.4%. Of these beds, the number of beds for individuals in these programs, in all of these programs, specifically targeted towards DV survivors, was only 9,753. So you can see the differences between the amount of populations that are identifying as DV survivors and the amount of beds that are actually available, or 12% of the total inventory of beds across homeless populations. So there's already a disproportionality there. And then the total number of adult-only households, or households without a child present, but can include more than one adult, served in ES, SH, or TH programs. It came up to 824,499, 29.4 of whom were female. So the disproportionality effect of in gender. And then aside from all of this, and we know that chronically homelessness is not always the reason why survivors leave, but we wanted to capture this point too. The total number of chronically homeless people who were heads of adults-only households served in emergency shelter, supportive housing, or transitional housing programs was 183,411, of whom 48,958, or 26.9%, were DV survivors. So DV survivors are showing up in different places, especially, and it really needs to be captured, is if it's a reason for homelessness in chronically homeless populations. And I want to highlight that it's important to note that this data represents survivors of domestic violence who access homelessness services that were not operated by a victim service provider and should not be considered the full estimate of survivorship among people experiencing chronic homelessness who assess the shelter system. So there are people who do not go to mainstream programs, and this does not capture all who are introduced into these systems. This was just a point in time in 2020, and a depiction of the counts that were across the nation. And how are we really addressing these types of disproportionalities, these disparities? Now, here's some more statistics in gender-based violence. Since March 2020, women have experienced historic job loss and income losses. And in December 2021, more than 8 million women were behind on rent and mortgage payments, with Black and Latina women hit the hardest. Latinx women hit the hardest. And over the course of their lifetime, 1 in 5 Black women experience eviction. And also, just another point, that this year or late last year in 2020, the count exceeded 1 in 3 women experience domestic violence. Increasing housing insecurity, especially among women with intersecting identities, reflects how women are situated in the economy. It has an effect on the economy, and it really, housing insecurity is a systemic failure with roots in discriminatory systems, racialized, gendered, ableist, and xenophobic norms. Now, 40%, DV is a leading cause for homelessness for women and children. And DV really, domestic violence interferes with access to housing, with success in maintaining the housing. Housing is a huge consideration in domestic violence survivors' decisions. Fleeing may mean losing housing and income. So many abusers or people of the public might say, "Oh, why don't you just leave?" Really, fleeing may mean losing housing and income and a host of other different things. And if the abuser leaves, a survivor may be unable to sustain their housing, as it's a loss, potentially a loss of income and support. And trauma and other impacts of domestic violence can severely disrupt survivors' lives and increase likelihood of job loss and homelessness. Now, homelessness increases the likelihood of domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. Experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity can increase the risk someone will experience in violence. So they're more they're more likely to have violent acts upon them if they're homelessness survivors are. And homeless women may seek safety in a new partner and become a victim of coercive control. So we talked about the domestic violence definition and how things there's a gamut of how violence and power and control you can have over the victim or over the survivor. And one of them can be coercive control. So the violence may show up in a different way. First, it might have been emotional power and control, and then it might show up as physical, and then it might show up as financial. So we have to really try to assess different types of violence when survivors are coming to service providers, and also help to create different types of habits for new relationships. And survivors can't maintain their housing. And survivors who can't maintain their housing are highly vulnerable to re-abuse. So it may show up again in a different form. Now, the correlation between sexual violence and homelessness. 50% of survivors of sexual violence may need to move for their safety. So about half may need to move. Not all, some can stay where they are. A majority of homeless youth reporting leave home due to sexual abuse. And this can really the cycle of violence that can happen from generations. Past experience with domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking is a significant contributor to chronic homelessness. And of that, 92% of homeless women have experienced severe physical or sexual abuse. 92%. So we need to have a level of options available for all of these populations. And that's when we was talking about safe housing. Now let's address some of those housing barriers for survivors. And of course, these are not the full list of barriers. These are some of the things that we have learned across communities and across continuums of care in the nation, and things that survivors have mentioned to be a barrier. Now, let's first talk about affordable housing. Of course, housing inventory is scarce and hard to find for the general public. Housing is definitely a human right, and it's a human rights issue. And many people are, really striving for their own affordable housing. So inventory is scarce. We always say we need more housing, right? We need more housing. Landlords can afford to be picky. That's another barrier. So landlords or property owners, they can choose who they would like as a tenant, or as a person in their property to live and reside. And if the survivor discloses the abusive background, landlords or property owners may fear harm to property and neighbors and consider them a nuisance. We'll talk a little bit more about nuisance laws later, but this might be something that is a red flag to landlords. And now housing providers, they can discriminate based on first impressions. This is another reason why housing navigators are so key in really being a part of the housing journey and housing plan for survivors to help prevent discrimination. And that includes the impact of trauma may hurt how a survivor presents. So they might not be showing up in a certain way to appeal to the property owner, or speaking in a certain way. And children accompanying a parent may display trauma-related behavior. And we have highlighted here tips from the substance abuse and mental health supportive services. And on this link, you'll see tips for talking to children after traumatic events. And they have like a 2-pager on how to really assess, different things, different resources available. Just wanted to point out that there's some resources here. If you look up on the SAMHSA website, there is tips on really how to address children, and of course you can use your own judgment on and culture on how you're engaging with children. And there's discrimination based on race, ethnicity, form of income, national identity, or religion. And we'll get a little bit dig a little bit deeper about forms of income. Now, with background checks, this is another thing a property owner might impose upon a future tenant. And they may want to check the credit history, including outstanding debt. So this could be a particular thing they would like to do. Some states, it's prohibited to have credit checks towards survivors of domestic violence because of the levels of coercive control. But some states do not. You'd have to check your local policies on checking credit when it comes to applying for a housing unit. You also want to, look out for your credit score, and that could be really low, or that could be kind of diminished because of subsequent from coerced economic abuse. Or it could be new credit. It might be a survivor who hasn't had established credit before, and they're looking for new housing as the heads of household. A couple of things I'd like to point out here when it comes to credit history and credit score is there are 3 major bureaus for credit, and that is the 3 major credit reporting bureaus are Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. And you can look online to see about your credit report or establishing your credit score. But those are the bureaus that you want to look into before going onto your housing journey and really trying to find housing solutions. So you can know where you're at, and you could use that as a negotiating factor when you're applying for housing. And if you do see something that needs to be addressed, you can go to your local center to have them help you create an adverse letter, and that may help dispute any fraudulent claims or help to improve your credit. And really encourage your survivor communities to look into financial literacy classes or something of the sort to help to improve their credit score and really increase their wealth. Now, another barrier can include rental history, especially an eviction. So if there are arrears based on, non-payment of rent, that's something to consider when looking for housing, to address those things first, or address them as soon as possible. And employment history is another barrier. It might be the first time a survivor is really seeking out, their career and their own desire for, for work. And that might mean they don't have established a long line of employment history, and the property owner can ask for several months of pay stubs or something of the sort, which can't really be provided. So all these considerations are barriers. And we want to make sure that survivors are equipped with knowing their sources of income, including TANF, or temporary assistance for needy families. Sometimes that shows up as cash assistance, Social Security income, or SSI, or housing vouchers. The emergency housing voucher, EHV, has been something in the past couple of years that has been used more often, and that's a source of income. Another barrier might be the survivor's criminal history or incarceration, often related to the abuse. Access to transportation. So barriers to housing and employment, including how you're going to get there, how you're going to get back home, and then especially this might be difficult in rural areas. They might not have access as in a major city. And also pets. Pets are our loved ones too. Sometimes pets, landlords' understanding and acceptance of therapy and animals might be a red flag, and pet damage deposits cause financial difficulties. Okay. Um, and one other thing, if you want to learn a little bit more about, please advise your survivors to look into access to help with mortgages, help with bankruptcies, help with divorce proceedings. All those things can also be barriers to credit and your history with financial um, resources. Housing navigation. Now, with limited trauma-enforced resources for community level housing, housing navigators or housing ambassadors, and realtors survivor support services, persons with lived experience or PWLEX have become extremely savvy in their self or peer advocation towards securing a home when fleeing abuse. Survivors have been really savvy about really supporting themselves on their own for this, and not and yes, there are opportunities for assistance in the community, but it might not be reliable. So, or fast acting. So these days you can be a really tech person and go about finding solutions on your own, but that doesn't mean it's okay. That just means that we've been savvy in trying to address our own complications and really find our own solutions. And most often a survivor's lens in housing search is a parallel directive from the provider lens in securing placement with landlords. So the way a survivor would seek housing navigation might be different, and many times it is different than the way that a victim service provider may go about seeking housing for the survivor. So they run on a parallel directive. They don't really intersect that much. And housing navigators really help with that, help with the intersections. Um, and homelessness is a result of domestic violence, as a result of domestic violence, may be a survivor's first experience finding a home, where knowledge on building and retaining housing may be an additional and unknown obstacle, especially considering accessibility needs, culturally specific language accommodations, and gender-based violence. So this could be a very overwhelming experience in need of support. And survivors must configure voucher acquisitions and benefit clips, the maximum and minimums for benefits, how much you can make, how little you need to make in order to be eligible for a certain program, as it pertains to their income levels. So these are a lot of things that survivors might have to juggle in really being maybe even the first time they're looking into this. And over time, survivors are burdened with plateaus. These are some of the barriers, which include long wait times for those vouchers to actually be approved, or long wait times to be placed. Of course, the shortage of units in general, and the shortage of units for single unaccompanied survivors, and multiple family compositions. So for smaller family compositions, like a family of one, or for larger family compositions, like a family of 6 or 5, there could be extended long wait times for those types of populations. And also, we have to think about communication and referral delays. How can you get to survivors when it's the holiday season, for example? It might be limited staff available, but we have to set up programs that really address survivor needs, no matter what is going on or the climate in society. Okay. So there's victim-specific housing. Example, domestic violence or sexual assault shelter and transitional housing programs. Now, while these programs typically center on safety and confidentiality, many survivors may still feel unsafe, unseen, tokenized, or marginalized. And program eligibility requirements, they can really create barriers for survivors. So in really looking into these programs and seeing if you can detect these types of things. There's an inadequate funding for victim specific housing to meet those needs, to meet survivor needs. And there's also elements of zoning in geographical regions and historical redlining of areas. There's some neighborhoods that accept shelters and some neighborhoods that are not really accepting of shelters for one reason or another. And there could be, that's limiting the amount of housing opportunities. So just all things to consider. So let's talk a little bit about cultural housing needs. Service providers and resources that reflect and represent culture and cultural values. That's also another one of HUD's priorities for the HUD NOFO, but really accentuating that there's different types of survivors from different walks of life, and addressing different types of people may need different types of services. And removing the expectation for survivors to educate providers about their culture, especially during crisis. Sometimes it takes the provider to gain some background knowledges on a multitude of cultures, or really seek out technical assistance that really can help train staff on the different dynamics of cultures in advance, so you can be kind of prepared for anyone that walks through the doors or walks through the computer. And really culturally specific healing options offered that include physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual wellness. So offering really a menu of options, again, for services as well as housing. And that could include holistic responses around individual and generational trauma. Survivors don't live one layered lives. They don't live non-linear lives. So there could be different types of trauma that could have been happening before the abuse that affects the abuse or affects the healing process. We want to build relationships too, while acknowledging a survivor's past experiences with the system. So this could not be their first time experiencing trauma or having to seek assistance from a system, but that affects their future really engagement with systems, levels of trust. And we want to provide ongoing and interactive training for staff members to address unconscious bias, those judgment calls. We really want to continue to do it on an ongoing basis. Now let's talk a little bit about those nuisance ordinances that we talked about earlier. And really what a nuisance ordinance is, crime-free ordinances that penalize tenants when the police are perceived as being called too many times. Oh, this person is troublesome. Now, domestic violence is the third most common reason for citations. Survivors were evicted or threatened with eviction in 83% of citation cases. So all these high numbers, really ordinances disproportionately impact people of color and people with disabilities. So those who are really calling for support, they're being judged on, when it comes to being a nuisance, they're being judged on, oh, this person is troublesome, but really it's a disproportionate impact. Maybe they're not getting their needs met. And tenants living in majority Black neighborhoods are 3 times more likely to receive a citation than in a majority white neighborhood when violating the ordinance. So this kind of goes back on that historical zoning and redlining. And a correlation exists between cities that experience large increases in residents of color and an increase in adopting these policies. So those gentrification, things like that, they might cause these nuisance ordinances to become a playing field. Now, evictions as a result of discrimination, nuisance laws may also increase victim blaming from landlords or property owners and community members. Or why are you letting them into the community? Distrust in the criminal justice system, the absence of offender accountability. So the offender and the person who experienced the harm both play a role when it comes to discrimination. And the impact of homelessness and housing instability on survivors and their children. So the children see and then perpetuate that later on in life. Could be. The ability of neighbors, landlords, and law enforcement to obtain and maintain racial segregation, and barriers to future housing opportunities due to evictions on the survivor's rental history. So again, that those things talking about economic disparity. Let's go on to the ongoing impact of violence and victimization. So we talked about stalking in our definitions. Stalking and the threat of violence can force survivors to frequently relocate. And shelter programs may require survivors to relocate as well. So that means they might move to a different zip code or a different county, to stay safe. And isolation from community, friends, and family can erode a survivor's safety net. So where survivors might turn to for support, they might be living far away, or they might not have access to engage with them as often, and that could cause levels of isolation. And unexpected challenges, including childcare, medical emergencies, or car repairs, can impact housing stability. Oh, sometimes it could be that small expense, the smallest thing, like getting a flat tire, can really impact survivors, method of transportation and getting around, getting to the supermarket, getting to work, and that can really impact housing stability. Now let's talk a little bit about economic abuse. We want to help with preventing resource acquisition, forbidding them to work, job sabotage, interfering in education and skill building, tampering with childcare, etc. All these things are impositions that a perpetrator can cause upon the victim or survivor that really forbids them from gaining that wealth, from gaining that, economic independence. And that's a cycle of violence that keeps them keeps the perpetrator in more control. And also they can prevent resource use, like withholding bank account information, denying them access to money, disabling the car, etc. All these things are things to consider, especially in the age of technology. You want to be very mindful of tech abuse when it comes to passwords and keeping things safe. And then we have exploiting resources, so generating debt in the survivor's name, or putting their name on certain accounts and not paying the bills to ruin credit, damaging housing unit, so causing any types of holes in walls of that nature, or breaking of things, which could be parts of physical violence. Using household income for drugs, alcohol, and gambling. All of these things can be exploited. And here are some financial assistance things to consider, survivor-specific considerations. So you want to look, as a service provider, look at, or encourage the survivor themselves to take a look at debt and debt arrears due to historic lack of control over finances, dislocations from social supports and resources, employment sabotage is common, complex aftermath of systems involvement, so that incarceration could be youth-related incarceration showing up in the adult life, and trauma that impacts may hamper income development. So getting that promotion, getting that new job, that new career, trauma can inhibit that or make it take longer than expected. Now, there are also things to consider when it comes to the emotional impact of housing instability. Attacks on a survivor's self-esteem, including that gaslighting, victim blaming, and long-stemming denial of personal needs and quality of life, has residual and lasting effects on some survivors' social and economic outlook of the future. The emotional toll and levels of toxic stress is an immeasurable weight towards survivors' agency. Survivors may be subjected to multiple systems touch points across institutions and agencies towards obtaining and sustaining their unit. So they might have to reach out to child welfare, the criminal court systems, the housing justice systems, and these are multiple touch points in institutions, just trying to get their housing, maintained or navigated through to find new housing. And therefore, leaving the abuser often means facing compounding conditions of poverty with an increased level of managing coping skills. So, and these are some of the things, reasons why the survivor might not leave. And also, the survivor can be experiencing isolation, especially considering the pandemic, with pandemic-related stay-at-home orders, and can influence productivity habits, income potential, and lack of resources to community assistance organizations. Survivorship may cause significant health and mental well-being impacts, including depression, post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, anxiety, really having a sense of belonging in the community, And this can vary from person to person in a household. So all these emotional aspects when it comes to housing instability, things to consider. And now I'd like to end our part one of our DV 101 training, and stay tuned and stay with us to really come on to part two. Thank you so much, and see you around for part two.